Chapter 4. For Eirik there was an end of the peaceful home life and the pure, innocent summer days. They were now a company of 4 young people, for it never occurred to Cecilia to go anywhere without her sister. But to Eirik's fevered senses it seemed that Bothilde clung to the younger girl. She was always a little in the rear, dropping behind with her indolent tongue and voluptuous gestures, and her everlasting shy and stolen sidelong glances. It was at himself they were aimed, and he felt them as if she had touched him with her hand. But as soon as he looked at her, her eyes turned away. It roused a kind of fury in the man, that she would never leave him in peace. He was ashamed of his own thoughts. Here he was at home with his father and his sister, but through Bothilde's fault he was harried and beset with desire. He felt inclined to deal harshly and cruelly with her when he got her in his power, to send her away from him in tears and overcome. It was a senseless whim, this spiteful prompting that sprang from an unknown depth in his soul, the blind and witless caprice of a master who is angry with a slave because he is irritated by the slave's frightened looks and humble efforts to conceal his sorrow. For it was of a thrall she reminded him, a woman captive. Even the 2 thick plaits which she wore hanging over her full, rather flaccid bosom made him think of chains. They reached nearly to her knees, and their weight seemed to force her head forward and give her a stoop in walking. And Bothilde's hair was not black and stiff as he had thought at first when he saw it wet. It had a soft brown hue with a tinge of red, and went well with her red and white complexion and her dark blue eyes. But not even her fairness sufficed to soften Eirik's mind towards her. He scarcely spoke to her. It was only in his thoughts, all this of Bothilde. To do anything to a woman who had lived in his father's house was not to be thought of. Besides, he was afraid of his father. Now that the peace and purity within him had been bemired, his childhood dread of his father was also reawakened in full force. Olav and Cecilia were either ignorant that anything was passing in secret between Eirik and Bothilde Askersdatter, or they misinterpreted what they saw, thought that the 2 disliked each other, or were shy of each other. In any case, neither the father nor the sister showed any sign that they thought about the matter. Jorund had quickly guessed what was wrong with Eirik, but he contented himself with hinting at it once or twice in jest. "I cannot make out," he said one day, with the sneering smile that Eirik disliked, "why you have such a mighty fancy to her. She sweats so much." Another time he said, it was one evening after they were in bed, "It is a great pity you cannot have her for a leman, since Olav is her guardian, and she cannot be rich enough for you to think of marrying her." Eirik was silent, overwhelmed with agitation. Marry her? She was the last woman in the world he would take to wife. It was not in that way he had thought of Bothilde. Jorund made ready for his departure. He was to be home for the nativity of Mary. Bard of Skiktrostad had made inquiries about Jorund. He must be reckoned a good match, said Bard. There was wealth at Gunnarsby, and Gunhild Reaper's sons might look to inherit more. Kolbein had been like a chief in those parts, and a man held in honour. The sons who were now in possession of the manor were not so well liked, but what folk had to say of them was for the most part such envious talk as was always heard when rich men stand on their rights. The two elder brothers were married to daughters of high-born men of good repute. So I will not seek to dissuade you from listening to them, if in other ways you hold Jorund to be worthy of your alliance, said Bard to Olaf. Olaf then let fall a few words to Eirik. If Jorund was so minded and his kinsman would consider the matter, there would be no harm in discussing it. When it came to the point, Eirik was a little dispirited. He did not know why, but now he thought all at once that there was no such hurry in getting Cecilia married. She was not much more than a child, his good little sister. One morning Cecilia said to her father that now she and Botild must move out and sleep in the women's house a while. They had to repair the winter clothing for the folk of the manor, and they would be working till late at night. Before Eirik went to bed that evening, he took out the clothes he was to wear next morning on the fjord. Olaf and the housecarls were going out after mackerel at dawn. Then he saw that the woolen shirt he meant to put on was ragged at the elbows. Eirik took the shirt and went out to ask his sister to mend it. The maids were still up, he had heard, as he went by their door just now. It was pitch dark in the anteroom. On the other side of the thin boarding he heard his sister clattering with chests and boxes. She called to Botild to open, as Eirik knocked at the door of the room. Then the door was opened, and the room was light behind her. The dark female figure in the doorway seemed to collapse with fright when she saw who stood outside. In her toneless whisper she said that Cecilia was busy turning out the clothes. "I will sew this for you." She put out her hand for the shirt. "Come hither," Eirik bade her in a low voice, and seized her by the wrist. With a little gasp of fear the girl obeyed. She bent her head under the lintel and let him draw her out into the anteroom. Instantly he took her in his arms and thrust her against the wall, pressed her closely and searched with his lips for her face in the dark, came upon her plaits and found the soft, ice-cold rounding of her cheek. With his kisses he nailed her head, which struggled to be free, against the wall. "Come with me," he whispered. "Come out with me." She gulped with terror. He heard her teeth chattering, and her soft, cold hands struggled in vain. She tried to defend herself, but had no strength. Eirik took them both in one of his and pressed them as though he would squeeze the blood out under the roots of her nails. So terrified was she that Eirik scarcely knew whether she understood a word of his wild and shameless whispering. Then Olaf called through the outer door. They had not heard him coming. He called for Cecilia. Eirik let go of Botild. He himself was trembling as Cecilia came to the inner door. "Are you two here?" she asked in surprise, and then spoke past them. "What is it, father?" Olaf asked for the little bucket he had brought up the week before to be cleaned. "Inga has surely forgotten it. I will find another for you, father." She went back for a lantern and came out again. "Have you been quarrelling?" she asked, half smiling, as the light fell on the faces of the two in the anteroom. Then she ran off. Eirik heard the sound of his father's iron-shod heels die away on the rocks of the yard. He had caught a glimpse of Botild's face, deadly pale, as she slunk through the door of the room. Now he went and looked in. She was crouching on her knees over a chest of clothes, her head sunk in her clasped hands. It made him furious to see her kneeling thus, as though in prayer. "Stand up," he said, and his voice was rude and harsh, "before Cecilia comes in. Do you wish her to find out about this?" Then he went out. As he went down to the waterside at dawn next morning, he saw her in front of him, carrying a great box. When he reached the boat, she had taken it on board and was just returning over the gangplank. Eirik put out a hand to help her. As he touched her for a moment, her body shrank up, and he saw she was dead white in the face, but under her eyes there were deep black rings. But she often had those, it struck him. No doubt that was why her eyes looked so big. But scarcely had Eirik stepped aboard when Olav came and told him he had better stay ashore. It might be they would stay out 2 days, and he half expected right off the sheriff to come on the morrow about a case. Olav gave Eirik orders as to what he should say and do if the sheriff came. Eirik stood watching the boat till it was lost in the morning mist. He could just see across the creek. The leaves of the little trees in the crevices of the rock were yellow already. He had scarcely noticed it, but here was autumn well on the way. He listened for the sound of oars in the mist. The little craft could still be seen, like a shadow. Eirik shivered a little. It was chilly. He turned to go up to the houses. As he passed the shed, he heard someone within. Instantly he halted and listened, stiff and tense. Could it be she? He stole up to the door and peeped in. Bothild stood with her back to him, taking dried fish out of a bundle. In 2 bounds he was upon her, throwing his arms about her from behind. He felt her body give way, as though every bone in it were dissolved. She hung powerless over his arms, which were crossed below her bosom. Then he flung her from him so that she fell on the floor. Eirik ran to the door and barred it. As he turned, she stood up and faced him, erect, with face aflame. "What are you doing?" Her eyes were big and black as coal. "You act like you are not acting like a man. Oh!" Bothild gave one scream, loud and shrill, and then her tears gushed out. A chill gust passed over Eirik. The sight of the girl's anger sobered him at once. But her tears plunged him headlong into a fresh tumult. He was bewildered by a sense of shame and misfortune, and her weeping frightened him. "Do not weep so," he muttered in his agitation. But Bothild continued to sob, so that the tears poured down her distorted features. Once she threw her hands before her face, but the next moment she let them drop heavily again. "What have I done to you?" she cried. "What sort of man have you become?" "Bothild," Eirik begged miserably, "you surely cannot mean that I meant it in earnest. It was only jesting." "Jesting?" Flashing with anger, she looked him full in the eyes. "Is that what you call jesting?" Then her tears got the better of her again. She wept so that she had to sit down, sank down upon a chest and turned her face from him. With her forehead leant against the wall, she now wept more quietly, in bitter lamentation. Eirik stood still. He could not find a word to say. At long last, Bothild turned half round to him again. She heaved a long, quaking sigh. It was not this I had looked for when you came home to us again." "When I came home?" asked Eirik weakly. "We thought you would surely come home again one day," she said almost scornfully. "We often spoke of it, Cecilia and I." Now she was weeping again. "Do not weep so," Eirik begged at last. Bothild got up, passed her hands over her tear-stained face. "Open the door for me," she bade him curtly. Eirik did so, but did not move from the doorway. "Stand aside," she said as before. "Let me out, now." Eirik stepped aside. Bothild went out past him. Eirik did not move. His surprise felt like a gleam of light within him, faint at first, then growing stronger and stronger. Now he was utterly unable to understand how he could have treated her as he had done. A little way up the hill he overtook Botild. She stood holding dewy leaves to her tear-stained cheeks and red eyes. As he stopped before her, she charged him without looking round. "Go!" He hesitated. Botild said impatiently, "Go now. I cannot show myself like this, all tears. You must see that." Eirik made no reply and walked on. He could not understand what had gone wrong with him. The moment the defenceless maid had turned to resist, it was as though a devil had gone from him. He was bewildered and ashamed, but not deeply, for already his own evil thoughts appeared to him unreal, nothing but an ugly dream. The sun shone brilliantly in the course of the day, and it was warm as summer. Eirik and the housecarl, who was left at home, were busy on the newly broken ground under the woods. Eirik worked hard. He always did so when once he had taken anything in hand. But at the same time he was deep in thought. Botild was in his mind the whole time. He could not forget her quivering rage and her bitter tears. And now, for the first time, he realized what she had said. She and Cecilia had often spoken of his coming home. A lingering, painful shame pierced him at the thought. Had these two poor little maids waited here all this time for their brother? Botild must have expected that he would look on her as another sister. The rude and turbulent thoughts he had conceived of her lay dead at the bottom of his soul, like the dried mud left by a flooded stream. And as new and tender green struggles up through the hardened grey slime, so did new thoughts of Botild shoot up in him unceasingly. That day he did not see her again till he came in to supper. She busied herself gently, holding her fair head bent as usual under the weight of her plaits, but the cowed and secret air that had been upon her and had provoked him to evil and sensual thoughts was now gone. She was merely a gentle young housewife, going calmly about her duties. Even her beauty now stirred him in another way. Now he saw nothing but sweetness and gentleness in her rounded red and white face, dignity in her languid movements, and in the fullness of her form. The sheriff did not come the next day, and by noon on the following day he was still not there yet. An hour or two later Eirik went down to get a bite of food. As he came out with a piece of bread in his hand, he heard Inga calling to Botild, who was sitting outside by the north wall of the house, towards the sea. He went thither. She sat in the sunshine, sewing the shirt he had given her that evening. She looked up for a moment as he came, but there was none of the anxious clinging look in her glance now. Botild bent over her sewing again. She looked melancholy, but calm and sweet. Eirik stood there, leaning against the corner of the house. When he had eaten his bread, and she had neither spoken nor looked up again, he had to break the silence himself. "Are you still angry with me, Botild?" "Angry?" she repeated in a low voice, and went on sewing in silence for a while. "I hardly know myself what I am, Eirik, for I cannot understand it. I cannot understand why you should treat me this way." Eirik was at a loss, for as he was about to reply that he had believed she was trying to allure him, he saw that he must not say such a thing. It would make the matter far worse. "I can promise you now," he said softly with a little sigh, "I shall not hurt you again." Botild let her sewing drop into her lap and slowly turned up her face toward him. Now Eirik was moved by it in quite a new way. The round white face with the two bright roses in the cheeks, the dark thoughtful eyes, the fine mouth which seemed small when she was distressed. Now his only desire was to pat her cheek, to pass his hand tenderly and kindly over the long white curve of her throat. He felt he wished her well with so warm a heart. "Is it for my aunt's sake," she asked him earnestly, "that you were so spiteful toward me?" Eirik seized upon this eagerly. "Yes, but now I cannot understand how I could think you were like Martha." "Even so, my aunt never desired anything else other than Olaf's welfare," said Bothild meekly. "She would always bid me be mindful of how great were the thanks we owed your father. God must reward him, we cannot. And I too wish him nothing but well. I am not greedy of authority, Eirik, but I consult Cecilia in all I do." Eirik felt a thrill of intense joy and relief. God be thanked for her innocence. She believed no more than that he was bad to her because he was jealous on his sister's account, or would avenge himself on her for the old ogress, her aunt. Beyond that she had no thought. She firmly believed he had only meant to humiliate her. He had heard sounds of horsemen coming down from Kvendal, and now he thought he must go and see who was coming. So there was no help for it. He had to tear himself away. The horsemen were already in the court. They were Ranvald Jonsson, the sheriff's young brother from Galaby, and Gaut Sigurdsson, whom folk called Virvir. Eirik had often met them in the 2 months he had spent at home. He called to Bothild, and she appeared at the corner of the house. "Ha ha ha!" said Ranvald with a laugh. "So you were not alone. Then our coming is untimely, I fear. Are you sewing that shirt for Eirik, Bothild?" Gaut Virvir rallied her. And now she hung her head again, and her eyes hovered this way and that. She hurried away, as though she would avoid them. Ranvald and the other had come by land, for they had had business up in the church town, and they were not altogether unrefreshed. So Eirik guessed it would be well to settle the matter in hand ere they went to table. The sisters had spread the cloth and laid the table when they returned from the upper chamber, and by that time the guests were hungry and not a little thirsty. While the men ate and drank, the 2 young maids sat in another part of the room. Ranvald tried conclusions with Cecilia the whole time, and Cecilia gave him sharp and snappish answers. But Eirik could see that this wordplay amused her. He had remarked the same thing before. His sister was ready enough for a wrangle. Bothild had relapsed into her diffidence and shyness, and seemed utterly miserable when Gaut teased her about a certain Einar from Tegnaby, whom she was supposed to have met in the summer, while staying with Signy Anasdatter at her daughter's house. Eirik did not like to hear her teased about another man, and he did not like her looking as though she had a bad conscience. Ranvald and Gaut delayed their leave-taking for some while after sundown. Then they would have Eirik and the maids to bear them company a part of the way. "No, I dare not go with you, Ranvald," said Cecilia Olafsdatter. "I might meet with the same misfortune as befell Tora Palsdatter. You jested with her so long that she put out her jaw with yawning. And it may be father and the men will soon come in. I cannot leave the houses. But you, Bothild, you might go up to leave, since Eirik can bring you back." So the 4 set off. Ranvald and Gaut let their horses walk in front. The 3 young men chatted together, and Bothild followed a little way behind with her box and her bundle. Dusk was already falling. A thin white mist lay over the pale autumnal fields, and the orange glow in the sky faded and turned to rust red. A bitter, withered scent hung about the alder thicket along the river, and the path was wet with the dew from falling leaves. At Rundmere, Bothild left the path. Before the men were aware of it, the dark, bent figure was already darting across the fields. Eirik would have gone on with the others, but they begged him with a laugh not to give himself the trouble. Then they mounted their horses. "Bitter cold to sport in the grove with one's fair lady," said Brunvald, laughing. "But I dare say you cannot choose your own time, you two. What with the old man always about you down there." "Good night," they both cried. "Beware, Eirik, lest the trolls snatch away your lady-love tonight." Eirik stood listening to the beat of their horses' hoofs as the two rode away into the dusk. Then he turned and went up to the cabin. There was a good fire burning on the hearth by the door, and a candle stood in an iron clip by Leave's couch on one of the raised floors. Bothild sat at the mother's feet, swathing the child. On the other side sat Anki and the 6 older children, eating the food Cecilia had sent. The savoury smell of a boiling pot of meat almost overcame the wonted evil odour of the hut. Comfort and unconcern in the midst of poverty met Eirik as he entered, ducking his head from the raw autumn evening outside. He sat for a while talking to Anki, while Bothild tended the child. She dawdled over it till Eirik grew impatient. Now she must come. It was already black night outside. They went, he in front and she behind, across the Rundmere fields, which showed faintly grey in the darkness, and down to the bridle path through the woods. They walked by the side of the river, which rippled and gurgled very softly among the bushes. There was hardly any water in it that autumn. Now and again Eirik heard that she was hanging behind. Then he stopped and waited till she came up. And every time he had to halt and wait like this in the dark under the trees, his evil will seemed to grow more irresistible. At last, when he had halted thus, she did not come. Eirik held his breath as he went back, treading as noiselessly as he could. He ran against her in the dark. As he took hold of her shoulder, he felt that she was trembling like one sick of a fever. "What is it?" His pulses were throbbing so that he could hardly command his voice. "I can go no farther," she whispered miserably. "Then we must rest a while." He took her in his arms and drew her to the edge of the road, where there was a little clearing among the trees. "It is your own wish," he muttered threateningly. Instantly Bothild tore herself away from him. It was a moment before Eirik recovered himself. He heard her flying footfalls on the path ahead, ran after her, then came a dull thud. Eirik nearly stumbled over the prostrate body. He knelt beside her. She had fallen face forward. Eirik took hold of her, put his hand over her mouth, and felt it wet with a scalding stream that came bubbling out. At first he did not know what it was. Disgust and rage boiled up in him. The girl was lying there vomiting. Then, with a shock of horror, he knew that it was blood. He turned her on her back, knelt in the mire of the path, and supported her against his chest. It was so dark that he could only just make out the pale round of her face and the dark flood that poured in pulse beats from her mouth. "Bothild, what is it? Have you hurt yourself so badly?" He could get no answer, but beneath his hand he felt the girl's heart throbbing as fast as his own. In vain he begged, time after time. "Can you not answer, Bothild? Bothild, have you hurt yourself?" At last he had to lay her down. He tore his way through the bushes. Stones scattered and gravel crunched under his feet as he floundered in the darkness, searching for a pool in the river bed where he could fill his hat. The water oozed through the felt crown. He had but a few drops when he found her again, and dashed them over her. And now he could smell the blood. His own clothes were drenched with blood, and he felt sick with horror and disgust. And Bothild lay silent, as though she were dead already. Then he saw there was nothing else to be done. He lifted her up in his arms. He was forced to get her home, but heavy she was as she hung lifeless in his embrace. That little distance over stocks and stones in pitch darkness was as long as eternity, and he himself was worn out inwardly with the wild desire that was shattered on this terrible mystery. After an age, it seemed to him, he reached the manor with his burden. He managed to open the door of the women's house, found his way to the bed and laid her on it. Then he went out in search of help. Cecilia, where was she? In the living room. As he came in, he saw his father and the 3 boatmen were sitting at the table over their porridge. His sister and the serving maid were hanging up clothes by the hearth. "Botild is sick, I think." Cecilia turned sharply, saw her brother standing there just in the firelight, with blood upon his face and hands as though they had been plunged in blood. With a loud groan she dropped the garment she was hanging on the bar, darted past him and out of the door. But Olav too had leapt up. He sprang over the table and out after his daughter. And the men had risen and came out into the room. "Jesus, Mary!" old Tor wailed. "Jesus, Mary! Has it come upon her again?" Inga, the serving maid, sighed as one who knew. "What else could we look for? 'Tis ever thus with the wasting sickness. It will not give up its hold when it has fastened upon a young body. I have thought this the whole time. For Botild, poor thing, there is no hope of cure." "Cecilia will take this sorely to heart," said one of the men. "I'll have too. They love her as their own flesh and blood." "Far too red and white," said Tor. "I was sure of it. No long life was in store for her. Like a stranger she was here. Little use was it that Olav had masses sung for her and was a father to her." Eirik had sunk onto the beggar's bench by the door. Without knowing it, he had hidden his face in his arms. It was as though veil after veil was being drawn from before his eyes. The wasting sickness, they said. She had had these blood vomits before. She had been sick the whole time, and no one had said a word to him of it. The whole time, while he had had such thoughts of her, had played his cruel game with her, she had been a sick child. Such were his thoughts when someone took him by the shoulder. How did it come about that she was stricken so sorely? Olav had spoken in a low voice. Eirik looked up. His father seemed already to have forgotten his question. He gazed vacantly before him in bitter grief. Eirik could not bear to look at him more than an instant. Now Cecilia came in. The housefolk swarmed about her with their questions. The maid merely shook her head. Her face seemed compressed. She would not weep. In haste she took out of her chest a little box and was going out again. "I will watch with you tonight," said Olav in a low voice. His daughter paused and nodded. Olav took her in his arms and held her face against his breast a moment. Then he went out with her. Eirik was outside the door of the women's house, but dared not go in. He thought of that other evening, when he stood with her between the doors. He had not guessed it was a sick woman. Inga came out after something. It was ill with Botild, she replied to Eirik's question. The smell of blood from his own clothes well nigh choked him. He went in and to bed. He had not guessed that she was sick, and now he began to understand what had lain behind her strange manner, till he was afraid and resisted and would not be forced to see it all. "Beware lest the troll snatch away your lady-love," they had said. Ranvald. Or was it gout? He had fancied she was not as she should be, pure and undefiled. But he had never dreamt that he who had defiled her was death. Cecilia came into the room with red eyes next morning. No, Bothild had slept but little, she answered. No, she had not spoken either, seemed to have no strength for that. She must have lost more blood this time than ever before. Cecilia took the clothes that her brother had worn the evening before. I will take charge of these and have them washed clean. I think it will be best for me to take myself away now, said Eirik doubtfully. Back to Ranvold, since you have sickness in the house. Is there any need for that? Asked Cecilia in surprise. Eirik said the same to his father when he met him later in the day. Olaf gave a start, looked at Eirik so strangely that the young man felt all his old fear of his father awakening. What if he had guessed? Or Bothild had said something to him? Eirik turned red and was furious with his father for causing him to blush. Olaf answered not a word, but went out. 2 days later, Eirik was ready for the road. He wished to set out early in the day, so he had to go and visit Bothild. He must bid her farewell before he left the manor. She lay with red roses in her cheeks, but when he came near to the bed, he saw that her face had sunk in, especially under the eyes. She had been holding a rosary in her hands. Now she hid it hastily under the coverlet. Eirik felt a choking pang of grief as he saw it. The sharp and acrid odour of sweat that had inflamed him so, now he knew what it meant. In the wasting sickness they sweat so profusely, for it devours them with the heat within, and that little cough of hers which had vexed him so. He stood still, resting both hands on the hilt of his sword. He found it impossible to say anything. If he were to ask her forgiveness, there would be no end to it. Rather would he have thrown himself on his knees, laid his head upon her sick bosom. You must not believe worse things of me than... My intent was not so evil as it must have seemed. With all my faults, I am not such as you believe me now. The sick girl lay looking at him with great dark eyes. You must tell me, Bothild. Can you forgive me? Yes, was all she answered. Eirik waited yet a little while. Then he went right up to the bed, took her hand. It was cold and clammy. Fare you well, then. He ventured so far as to stroke her cheek, but her face was hot as fire. God give you health again, that you may be well when we next meet. Farewell, Eirik. God be with you. His father and sister went with him no farther than to the barn. Alone he had to ride from home. And he could not shake off his heaviness. He felt like one who rode away an outlaw and accursed.